The special share tonight is in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Sandor Kirsch.
Oops, I need you to unmute yourself.
Okay, unmute. That's okay. You hear me?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, okay. It's in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Sandor Kirsch. Besides being honored members of the Chicago community, they were really parental figures to the members of my shul. And you know, every generation you have the older generation giving over to the younger generation. But in our time, it wasn't just a question of giving over from one generation to another generation. It was giving over from one era to another era. And the Kirsches, perhaps more than anybody else in our shul, represented that transmission, the giving over from the era of Europe, the era pre the Holocaust, and continuing into the Holocaust, and then bringing it over into America. The Torah tells us, the Medrash tells us that about Noach Tzaddik Tamim Haya B'Dorosav. Noach was a righteous person in his generations. There are people that are able to be righteous in a particular generation. There are people that are able to adapt to particular situations. But Noach faced a challenge that most people do not face, and that is generations. It required a certain skill to be an Ish Tzaddik, to be a righteous person before the Mabul, before the flood, in a generation that everybody was sinning. It required a special talent during the flood, when the whole world was being destroyed. And then it required a special talent, a special ability after the flood to rebuild the world. And I can't think of anybody in our community who symbolized these three generations, before the flood, during the flood, and after the flood. Noah faced a flood of water. Our previous generation faced a flood of fire. They were righteous before the flood, they were righteous during the flood, and they continue with their righteousness and building their family and helping build a community after the Holocaust. Now, and I mentioned to Lynn certain topics, and one of the topics was about the Patriarchs and Matriarchs of Klal Yisrael as viewed from the Chumash Bereshis. And I think that the Kirsches represented the patriarch, and certainly in our community and our shul, they were the patriarch and matriarch. Not only, as I mentioned before, because they came from former generations from Europe, from before the war, and built a family here, but they were actually a parental figure to many of those in our shul. There were people that used to eat Shabbos, that they didn't have their own Shabbos meal. They would eat by at Mrs. Kirsch's house. I remember when a certain person who was an outstanding individual, but for whatever the circumstances were, he wasn't able to have his own Shabbos meal in his house, and he would eat in the Kirsch home. And when he passed away at a young age, Mrs. Kirsch says she felt like somebody in her family, like a child of hers, passed away, because she had this matriarchal role in our shul. So I felt talking about the patriarchs and matriarchs of Klal Yisrael would be the proper topic to discuss in their memory. Now, there are contradictions among the poskim and in the Midrashim and in the Gemara as to what was the status of our ancestors. What was the status of the Jewish people before the Torah was given? We're now approaching Shavuos. Shavuos represents the holiday of Matan Torah. And also, to a certain degree, it's the holiday of Gerus. That's the reason, one of the reasons why we read Rus on Shavuos. And and some of the halachos, the laws of conversion, are learned from Matan Torah, from the giving of the Torah. And the implication would be that if we learn the laws of Gerus from Matan Torah, that prior to Matan Torah, our ancestors did not yet have Dushas Yisrael, did not have the sanctity of being Jewish. But we see, on the contrary, from many Midrashim, the Midrash says that Basia, the daughter of Paro, the one who saved Moshe, who played a role in bringing Moshe up, she went, when she discovered Moshe, Lirchotz al hayor, she went to wash herself on the Yor, on the Nile River. And the Medrash says, Lirchotz megilulei aviha. The implication being that she went to undergo a process of gerus, a process of conversion. This Medrash seems to imply that if there was gerus before the giving of the Torah, there certainly was Kedushas Yisrael, there was the sanctity of the Jewish people. And then more than that, the Gemara in Dushin tells us that Esav, Yisrael Mumar Habe, Esav, there's a discussion in the Gemara whether we could deduce halachas concerning inheritance regarding non-Jews from Esav, and the Torah and the Gemara says no, you can't deduce it from Esav because Esav was a Jew. Esav Yisrael Mumar Habe. He was a sinner, but he was a Jew. His descendants were not considered Jewish. To be Yitzchak Yikar L'Chazara, from Yitzchak will be your descendants, the low call Yitzchak, not all of Yitzchak, as we'll see later on. So if Esav was considered a Jew, there obviously was Kedushas Yisrael. There was the sanctity of Jewishness even before the giving of the Torah. And many answers are given. The Rishonim use the expression that in Matan Torah there was a tosfos dusha. There was an additional sanctity. But we have to understand, what does that mean? Now, I heard from my father that my father suggested that until the giving of the Torah, and he uses that to answer many questions, until the giving of the Torah, there was individual Jewishness. But the formation, the halachic formation of a Jewish nation, and having the Kedusha that emanates for being part of that sanctified nation, that only happened in Matan Torah. To a certain degree, we could attribute to Ish Echad B'Leiv Echad, because at the time of Matan Torah, they formed together all the Jewish people as one nation. They said Na'aseh v'Nishma. When they accepted the Torah not just on themselves as individuals, but they accepted the Torah for the whole nation. So at Matan Torah, prior to Matan Torah, there was individual sanctity. But at the time of Matan Torah, there was national sanctity that was given to the Jewish people. Now, the Gemara in Yuma says that Avraham Avinu observed all the mitzvahs of the Torah. Not that there aren't certain exceptions, but as a general rule, the Gemara says, now I don't know that every Mandi Omar in the Gemara agrees to that. My personal feeling is that it was a controversial statement. In other words, when I say controversial, I don't mean chas v'shalom that I'm going to disagree with that. But my sense when I read the Gemara is that not everybody, not all the Amoraim, not all the rabbis of the Talmud agreed with that. But it certainly seems to be the accepted opinion in the Talmud that Avram Avinu, as a general rule, observed the mitzvos of the Torah. Obviously, was given to him Baruch HaKodesh. Now the commentators are troubled because they assume that Avram Avinu observed the Torah. How was Yaakov Avinu able to marry two sisters from the same father? The prohibition of marrying two sisters from the same father, that's a prohibition that applies only to the Jewish people. So the question is, how was Yaakov Avinu able to marry both Rachel and Leah? If the prior to Matan Torah, especially the Avos, the Patriarchs and the Matriarchs, they observed the whole Torah, or with some exceptions. How were they able to marry two sisters? Now, the most famous answer to that question is the answer of the Ramban. The Ramban says that prior to Matan Torah, the mitzvos were observed, but only in Eretz Yisrael, only in the land of Israel. But outside the land of Israel, I assume based on need or whatever it might be, the mitzvos were not observed like they were observed in the land of Israel. And he goes on to say that Rachel and Leah married Yaakov only because they was outside Eretz Yisrael. And the Ramban even suggests that after he entered Eretz Yisrael, Rachel dies shortly after they enter Eretz Yisrael. But until Rachel dies, he only lived with one of them. That's what the Ramban says. Now the question is, why should Eretz Yisrael be different? There are all kinds of suggestions that we could make. One is in Eretz Yisrael. Now, it's very interesting. When you view the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, you can view it from the perspective of the closeness to God that Eretz Yisrael affords us, because one can sense the presence of God in Eretz Yisrael more so than you can sense it everywhere else. Of course, God is everywhere. But for some reason, we can become more sensitive to the presence of God in Eretz Yisrael. And the mitzvos of the Torah also make us sensitive to the presence of God. I would suggest another possibility. This is more along the lines of the Rambam, although I'm not sure that the Rambam was of the opinion that the Avos observed all the mitzvahs of the Torah. But the Rambam seems to say that when he interprets the observance of the mitzvahs of the Torah prior to the giving of the Torah, so he understands the mitzvahs of the Torah as mitzvos that were given to the Jewish people to wean them from idolatry. And in a sense, it was, according to the Rambam, I think, It was the approach that Avram Avinu used in separating himself from the practices of the nations of the world at that time. And in a sense, the mitzvah that Avram Avinu was, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha, go to the land that I'll show you, meaning Eretz Yisrael, was part of the mitzvah of separating himself and separating future generations from the practices, the idolatrous practices of the nations of the world. And so we could suggest that that's why the mitzvos were observed in Eretz Yisrael more carefully prior to Matan Torah, because it wasn't just the question of submitting to the Gzeros, submitting to the laws of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it was a practice of separating oneself from the practices of the nations of the world. And that was part of the mitzvah of leaving his birthplace that was given to Avram, to leave his birthplace and to go to the land of Israel. Now, however, there is another possible explanation. Actually, there are many more possible explanations, but we don't have time to go into all of them, that is based on something that Reb Chaim Volozhiner says in the Nefesh HaChaim. It's really has a mystical approach. It's a Kabbalah approach. And he says, the Reb Chaim Volozhiner, and it really to a certain degree, the Nefesh HaChaim is, I would say, the Misnagdish introduction to Kabbalah. And in a sense, he says that the mitzvos of the Torah, that man, in a sense, God placed limitations on himself, and he let man control him in the way he acts with the world. And he mentions the pasuk, Ba'al hakisei kidmus adam, and on the throne was like the likeness of man. In other words, man has the ability, figuratively, only because God let him, to tie the hands of God, to, in a sense, limit God's intervention as to what takes place in the world. On the other hand, when the Jewish people act in the proper manner, so then man, in a sense, controls the world, and by control the upper worlds. Again, this is a mystical concept. Controls the upper worlds, which then empower God to intervene more often in what is taking place in the lower worlds. This is how Reb Chaim Volozhiner explains. And then he said, so that's the power of mitzvos. The power of mitzvos is, according to the mystical tradition, the empowerment of heaven intervening in what takes place in the lower worlds. And he says, before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, so the mitzvos were observed for that reason, because the mitzvos of the Torah represent the empowerment, in a sense, man's empowerment of God and man's empowerment of heaven in intervening in what takes place down in this world. So, but after Matan Torah, after the Torah was given, then we observe the mitzvos not just because of what the mitzvos accomplish in the upper worlds, but we observe the mitzvos as an act of submission, because at Matan Torah, the mitzvos became commandments. And he said that's why there are more exceptions to the observance of the mitzvos before the giving of the Torah than there was after the giving of the Torah. The Palgei Mayim, that was the parish of the Nesivos, Anecha. So he says that the bad things that happen in the world do not come from God. But what happens is that as a result of the sins, God loosens his control on the world and he doesn't intervene. And we say in the Haggadah, he doesn't mention that, but I'm adding that to explain what he says. In every generation, there arises people who want to destroy us. God intervenes, and God intervenes, and God saves us. And in a sense, in every generation, you think that there was only a Hitler during the Holocaust in the 1940s. There were Hitlers in every generation. But for what God intervened. In World War II, for whatever reason, ultimately God did intervene. But it wasn't in the same way. We do not understand. People write lots of books, but we are not capable of understanding it. But it was God, in a sense, loosened his involvement in the world because, for whatever reasons. So what we could suggest is that this is how Reb Chaim Volozhiner explains the difference. We could say that according to the Ramban, of course, this does not explain as much as Reb Chaim Volozhiner. The Ramban's opinion was, while he might accept the approach of Reb Chaim Volozhiner in a general way, but it could be that his feeling was that the effect that mitzvos and averos have on what goes on in heaven is much stronger in Eretz Yisrael than it's outside of Eretz Yisrael. And because of that, before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, when the mitzvos became commandments and we have to submit to them just as an act of submission, and the mitzvos at that time were observed because of the impact. And the Ramban, we know, followed the mystical tradition. So in Eretz Yisrael, it had a much stronger effect, the mitzvos that were observed before Matan Torah. And it's very interesting, just along the same lines, we're approaching Shavuos now. And the Gemara Menachos, very strange Gemara. And I'm not going to go into it in detail. I'm not sure that this explanation is one that I favor, but the Gemara raises the question as to what happens if grains of wheat fall from heaven. So Tosfos explains the Gemara altogether differently. But from Rashi, it appears the Gemara is explained literally. So some explain whether you could use the flour from the grains of heaven that fell from grains of heaven for the Shtei Halechem, for the sacrifice of the Shtei Halechem, which was given on Shavuos. And the way some explain it, again, I don't know that I would explain it that way, is because the halacha is that the grains that are used for the Shtei Halechem had to come from Eretz Yisrael. But in a sense, Eretz Yisrael is like heaven on earth. Lintoa Shemayim. The Lisod Oretz, the Lomar Litzion Amiyata. In a sense, Eretz Yisrael is heaven, and it's more than that. Shavuos to a certain degree. What was Shavuos? Now the Gemara discusses about the mitzvah of eating and drinking on Yom Tov, and the Gemara discusses specifically about Shavuos. And it says specifically about Shavuos, there certainly has to be a mitzvah in eating on Shavuos, because that was the day that the Torah was given. Now the question was, and Rabbi Yossi said, if not for that day, Kami Yossi Ika Beshuka, how many Yossi would there be in the market? Would there be in the marketplaces? In other words, the holiday of Shavuos, because he was involved in Torah learning, had special meaning there. But the question is, it seems the very opposite. But the answer is, and I think in Chassidus, the attitude was that prior to Matan Torah, there was a separation between heaven and earth. But after Matan Torah, the separation between heaven and earth was removed. In other words, when the Mitzvos were observed prior to Matan Torah, it was observed in order that the Mitzvos should go from earth to heaven. But the separation was, in a sense, earth, and specifically Eretz Yisrael, becomes part of heaven. And because Eretz Yisrael becomes part of heaven, and because of the world, the separation is removed. So in a certain sense, the Torah emphasizes after Matan Torah sanctification of the mundane, sanctifying the physical. So Shavuos, there is a special mitzvah of eating and drinking, because eating and drinking represents the mundane. And Shavuos, we sanctify the mundane because the separation between heaven and earth was removed. Okay, so that would explain the Ramban's opinion. Now, the Das Kenu of Balatosphus gives another reason. He says because Rachel and Leah underwent Gerus conversion, and we have a rule, Gershon is Gayer, Katan Shanola Dami. So they lost their relationship as sisters. So consequently, there was no prohibition. That's what the Tosfos says. Now, but there's an additional question that's asked, and I'm going to try to suggest an altogether different approach than was suggested by the Rishonim. The additional question is asked: why is it if the Avos, especially Avram, they observed the mitzvahs of the Torah before the Torah was given? So why is it that Avram waited until HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him the mitzvah of bris milah to undergo circumcision? Why didn't he undergo circumcision prior to that? Now, so after all, he observed all the mitzvahs of the Torah. Why specifically did it start? Now, a simple answer I once suggested, and then later on, I think I saw in my uncle's name that the mitzvahs of the Torah, but I have a lot of questions on that answer anyway, that the mitzvahs of the Torah became significant only once Abraham became Jewish. And only once Abraham became Jewish. So, and to a certain degree, the mitzvah of bris milah, that was the initiation of the Jewishness of Abraham. So, and according to many, that represented the gerus of Abraham. There is a question whether Abraham himself was a ger, or Abraham was just the first Jew, not a ger. The explanation for that opinion that he wasn't the ger, in other words, a ger comes from the word gargir, a seed, A seed is something that doesn't have roots. So Avram was the root. In other words, an immigrant, someone who's an immigrant, he doesn't have roots in the country that he came into. But Avram Avinu and Sarah, being the first Jews, they were the root of the Jewish people. Even though it says that they were Tchila Legerim, in other words, they were, in a sense, were the first Jewish people that didn't have a Jewish past, but they themselves perhaps did not undergo Gerus. The bris milah was a mitzvah, but it wasn't a form of gerus. But others say, from the Daskenim Baal Tosfos, it seems that Avram and Sarah were considered gerus. Were considered gerus. But the truth of the matter is, there are two forms of gerus. When someone undergoes gerus, on one hand, he cuts himself off from his past. On the other hand, in joining the Jewish people, he is joining a people that he is the first generation, and to a certain degree, he is not part, he does not have a foundation there. And we could say about Avram Avinu, even if you say Avram wasn't the ger, because he was the root of the Jewish people, he was a ger from the perspective of cutting himself off from his past. That's lechacha mi'artzecha mi'moladcha mi'beis avicha el aretz asher areka. So Avram perhaps had one form of gerus. He perhaps did not have the other form of gerus, because he was the root of the Jewish people. And it's very interesting, the Chinuch says that the mitzvah of avas hager, of loving the ger, of showing devotion to the ger, says doesn't just apply to a ger, somebody who comes from another nation and undergoes gerus. He says, let's say there's a new person in the neighborhood. Let's say in schools, there's a new student who doesn't have friends yet. There's a special mitzvah of showing friendship, because in different ways, they are gargirs. And I think there's an important lesson here for us, for the Jewish people, and a mistake that the Jews of the previous generation made. The question is, when the Jewish people who were survivors from the Holocaust and those who came over during the Holocaust, they were certainly gerim in that respect. They came to a country that they didn't have roots in. Many of them established themselves later on, built families. They helped build communities. And if you see Torah flourishing today, it's because of the survivors and their children. But the question is, how did we, the Jews of the United States at that time, treat the Gerim that had the same background as us, from the same patriarchs and matriarchs? And this is a lesson. This was a challenge that many, where this year is in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Sandor Kirsch. They were survivors. They came over, and to a large degree, they had to build themselves. They built a family. They established themselves in the community. But I don't know that our community, when I'm not talking about our generation, and I'm not talking necessarily about Chicago, I'm talking about the United States in its totality, whether we fulfilled our commitment to those who came over. So, but I want to give a different approach. Now, it's very interesting. The Gemara says, we see Avram Avram, his name was changed from Avram to Avraham. Yitzchak had no name change whatsoever. Yaakov, he had a name change, but he kept his former name. Avraham, the Gemara says, if somebody calls Avraham, Avram, over Basei, over below Saseh, you're not supposed to call Avram by his prior name. Whereas Yaakov, even though he received the name Yisrael, we see that he's constantly called Yaakov. And the Gemara asks the question, why? And the Gemara says, because we see that God referred to Yisrael as Yaakov, even after he gave him the name change, okay? But what is the lesson that we have to learn from that? And I think the lesson that we learn from that is that Yaakov and Yisrael, when you take a look at the Torah, and it's not just the Torah, when you look at history, a name change signifies two different situations. Could be three, but I'm going to focus on two of them. One situation is a change of identity. And the second is a rise in position. Yosef, when Paro appointed him as Mishnah Lamelech, a second in command, he gave him the name Tzafnas Paneach. And that was the custom, we know, among Roman emperors, and I'm sure among other kings as well at that time. When someone was promoted to a position of authority, a high position of authority, a name change would be given an additional name. That would be his royal name. And I'm sure among his friends and among his family, he retained his former name. When it's a change of identity, there is a negation. There is a negation of his past. Avram went from Avram to Avraham. He went from being a non-Jew into being a complete Jew. It was a change of identity. And so in addition to being, I think at that point, that's when he becomes the Av of Klal Yisrael, the father of the Jewish people. The name Avram is given to him almost simultaneously with the mitzvah of Bris Milah. The Yitzchak and Avram is different than Yitzchak. Yitzchak was born as a father of the Jewish people. As the Torah tells us, Ki v'Yitzchak yikara l'chazara, from Yitzchak will be your descendants. Avram was not even born Jewish, certainly wasn't born as a father of the Jewish people. But Yitzchak was born as a father of the Jewish people. So there's no name change, not even an additional name given there. Yaakov retains his name. Yaakov was born a Jew. But Reb Chaim mentioned, not in regard to this question, to explain a certain Rambam, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. Reb Chaim said there was a difference between Yitzchak and Yishmael on one hand, and Yaakov and Esav on the other hand. Yishmael was excluded from birth, from being the patriarch of the Jewish people, whereas Yaakov and Esav, the Gemara says, Ki v'Yitzchak yikara l'chazara, from Yitzchak will be your descendants. Below kol Yitzchak, but not all of Yitzchak's descendants will be successors to Avram and Yitzchak. it wasn't determined at that point which one it would be. Of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew, but halachically it wasn't decided, as the Rambam says, until Yaakov got the bracha of Yitain Lecha es Birchas Avraham. When Yitzchak told Yaakov before he went to leave Eretz Yisrael, you should get the blessing of Avraham. At that point, Yaakov was appointed as the successor. But I think being the successor many years ago, I'm talking probably in the 1930s, maybe in the 1930s, maybe it was early 40s. So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky came to Boston, and he spent some time there in my uncle's house. And he had a custom, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, of learning Tanakh every morning. And that morning he was learning about Shaul and David. And he was intrigued, and he asked my uncle. Now, I heard this story from my uncle, Rabbi Yisrael Shurin, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. And he was also a Talmud of my uncle, the Rav, in Boston. My uncle had a kollel in those days in Boston. So he told me over the story, and he even makes a quick reference to it in his sefer. So at that time, they were discussing the question, once David was appointed king, what was the status of Shaul? And also, what was the status of David until Shaul died? We had two kings.
Hi, Lisa.
Hello?
Lisa? Hold on a second.
So what was their status? But my uncle said to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky that it's actually this idea is mentioned in my uncle's sefer. He doesn't mention the story with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, but my uncle said to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky that there is a difference between melech and malchus. In other words, a person could be a king, could be a melech, but not yet have malchus, not yet have kingship. And to a certain degree, both David and Shaul, they were both kings simultaneously, but neither of them yet had full malchus. Shaul didn't have full malchus, I assume, because it was ripped off from him. It wouldn't continue. And part of malchus is the continuation of the kingship. And Shaul was still ruling to a large degree. So I think when it comes to positions of leadership, people could be appointed to positions of leadership, but their leadership did not reach the point where it's supposed to reach yet. Now, my uncle said something very interesting. My uncle said, when you take a look at Parshas Chayesara, after Sarah dies, very little is mentioned in the Torah about Avram, other than buying a grave for Sarah and getting a wife for Yitzchak. But in terms of himself, other than that he gets married, very little, and that he received a lot of brachas, very little is mentioned about Avram. Why is it? And my uncle said, because the leadership of matriarch-patriarch relationship, it was a joint leadership. It was a joint leadership. So in a sense, after Sarah dies, certainly until Yitzchak, after Sarah dies, Avram's leadership role will come to an end when Yitzchak gets married. So, in a sense, we could suggest, when did Yaakov become the leader of Klal Yisrael? Yaakov became the leader of Klal Yisrael. He was appointed leader when he got the bracha, when he got the blessing, V'yitein lecha es birchas Avram. But when God gave him the name Yisrael, what does the name Yisrael mean? The name Yisrael, the Torah says, Ki sarisa im Elohim ve'im anoshim batuchal. What does that mean? So Rashi explains, you fought with Malachim. Targum Onkelos explains it differently. Ki sarisa, you became an officer. It comes from the word sar. Im Elokim, with God. Ve'im anshaya, and over people. In other words, the name Yisrael was indicative of Yaakov, assumed not only being appointed as the leader of the Jewish people, but assuming the position and acting as the leader of the Jewish people. So, in a sense, we could say that Yaakov, until he got the name Yisrael, he did not yet have the role while he was appointed as a leader of the Jewish people, he did not yet have the role as the leader of the Jewish people for future generations, as the Av of Klal Yisrael. He was an Av, but the main one at that point was still Yitzchak. And so at that point, when we say, what I want to suggest is that why is it that the Yavos felt that they were compelled to observe the Mitzvos? Because they had to set the example for future generations. A parent teaches not just by word of mouth, but a parent teaches by example. So the Yavos had to observe the Mitzvos, perhaps not because of what was taking place at their time, as I had suggested earlier, in the name of the Rambam, but an alternative explanation is because of the future. But the obligation of fulfilling that role perhaps was only complete when they were not only appointed to be an Av of Klal Yisrael, to be a patriarch of Klal Yisrael, but actually assumed that role. Just like the king would only write the Sefer Torah, v'haya kishivto al kisei mamlachto. And the Rambam mentions all the laws of kings, but he says writing a Sefer Torah, which is the words of the Torah, is when he sits on his throne. When he had to sit on the throne when he wrote it. But it means sometimes a person is appointed king, but he does not yet function completely as the king. Then he has to write the Sefer Torah, because that's when he serves as the example for the Jewish people. And I think the same thing could be said about the Avos, about the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people, that it was when they sat, in a sense, when they assumed that role, as that's when they had to observe all the mitzvos. When he married Rachel and Leah, so Yaakov did not yet assume the role. He was appointed as an Av of Klal Yisrael, but it was the period of the leadership of Yitzchak still at that point. Consequently, at that point, Yaakov was still able to marry two sisters, because he did not yet have that obligation of demonstrating for future generations about commitment to Torah and Mitzvos. And I wanted to suggest, and it's interesting. In the Chayesara, it's brought down that Abraham married Keturah, and Keturah was according to our sages. There are some Mefarshim that offer different opinions, but Keturah was Hagar, who was an Egyptian. And the Das Kenim Bala Tosfos asks, how could Avram marry Keturah? The Avos observed the Mitzvos of the Torah. And the halacha is that a first generation, the second generation, mitzvahs. Until the third generation, you're not allowed to marry a mitzvah, an Egyptian woman. So how could Avram marry Hagar? But the answer, so Tosfos suggests because Avram was a ger, he had the opinion that Avram was a ger, so a ger could marry a mitzvah. Then he says it was al pi hadibur. It was God's told Avram to marry her, but I personally I think that we could suggest we could suggest also, because it seems that in the time of the Avos, certainly in the time of Yosef, the line of pharaohs at that time were from the Hyksos. And the Hyksos were not real Egyptians. So it could be that the Egyptians that were prohibited to Klal Yisrael were not the royal families that were in the time of the Avos. The Hyksos were foreigners that invaded Egypt, and for a period of time, and those were probably the Egyptians that were close to the Jewish people. It could even be suggested, I don't know, that the Erev Rav, who joined the Jewish people in leaving at the time of the Exodus, might have been, many of them might have been from the Hyksos, who had a past relationship with the Jewish people. Of course, they didn't act properly, and they led the Jews astray. So we could give that answer, but we could also answer, at that point, Yitzchak was already married. Because Yitzchak was already married, he already assumed the role as a leader, as the Av of Klal Yisrael. He was not just the Av of Klal Yisrael, but then you could say his fathership, or whatever you want to call it, his parenthood of Klal Yisrael was active. And at that point, to a certain degree, he was the main parent. At that point, Avraham was allowed to marry somebody who later generations of Jews might have been prohibited from marrying. Some of the people, not all the people. So that's the way we could answer that question. And in other words, this is what I just want to conclude that when we think, I mentioned before about the concept of gerus, people in the Kirches, in a sense, they had to cut themselves off from their past. They were forced. They were pressed, but they brought over the Torah, but they did it not just by telling, not just by talking, but they did it by example. And the commitment of their children and grandchildren and their identification with Jewish tradition comes from the fact that they had that patriarchal and matriarchal approach of teaching by example, teaching by demonstration, by being devoted, by devoting to family, by being devoted to Torah, by being devoted to the community. And they should serve as an example for us. They should continue to serve as an example for us and for future generations of commitment to family, to Torah, and to the Jewish people. Okay, I don't. I will. If there's any questions, I don't know if the questions could be asked. Is he there?
I have a question.
Yeah. What's the question?
So often there's a lot of comparison between Avram and Ruth in terms of, they say Avram was chesed, Avram, and
That's
Ruth
right.
was, also now you're saying that Avram could be considered a ger and Ruth was.
Well, Ruth was certainly a Gioris, and Avram certainly.
Why we read Ruth and Shavuot, or
Well, one thing's for sure, the Jewish people at Matan Torah became the first generation. The Jewish people underwent gerus. They underwent gerus. There's no question. But as I pointed out, that was a national gerus. That was a national gerus, that the tusha of the nation. And when the Jewish people, they, in a sense, formed the Jewish nation, and whenever somebody else goes through gerus, he not only becomes a Jew individually, but he joins the Jewish people. And that's what Rus said. Amechami velakayach elakai. She didn't just identify with the religion of the Jews. She identified with the nation of the Jewish people. Amechami. And this was Klal Yisrael at Matan Torah, when the Ki'ish Echad B'Leiv Echad, it was the formation of the Jewish people as a nation. And that's what chesed, the chesed that we do for Jews. Avram had the midah of chesed for every person. But there's a special trait, a special concern, just like you're expected to do more for your family. And you have to do chesed. Avram, after he does gerus, after his gerus, he takes in the three. He didn't know they were angels. The three travelers we thought were non-Jews. He was dedicated to all human beings, but nevertheless, there's a special mitzvah of chesed in regard and tzedakah in regard to Jewish people. You see, when the Torah very often talks about tzedakah, it talks about your brother who comes in hard times. The mitzvah of tzedakah is a mitzvah of helping every human being out. But for a Jew, the mitzvah of tzedakah, of helping out, manifests itself in showing brotherhood, a relationship. And we could say that's the reason there's a mitzvah that you should show priority to tzedakah, to family, where you have to give either to family or to somebody else, because the essence of the mitzvah of tzedakah is showing brotherhood, showing that you're family. Any other questions that anybody has? Okay. Huh?
I just want, I don't know if anyone has any more questions, but I just want to really thank you personally, and also thank you because I think it's such a good way to go into Shavuot, thinking this and learning, like to begin. So if anyone has any questions, great, and if not, then
I just want to add one thing. Years ago, I had a very close friend, a big Talmud Chacham, Rav Felder. He was the head of the Beis Din in Philadelphia, and he was, in his time, he was the closest student of Moshe Feinstein. And we used to talk every Friday. He would sometimes come here to Chicago. When we were doing gerus, he was the head of our Beis Din. And we would discuss shilas all the time. And because what I said about the Mrs. Kirsch, I wanted to emphasize. And the question came up that he was asked the shaila. He says, when we call a ger up to the Torah, we say ben Avram. The question is, when you make a mishaberach for a ger, should you say ben Sarah or do you say ben Avram? So I brought it for him a proof, and he liked the proof. The Medrash says that when Yitzchak was born, Sarah fed Yitzchak, but the Medrash tells, the Torah says, but the Medrash says many women at that time brought their children to Sarah, and she fed those other children also. And the descendants of those children all became Gerim. And then the Medrash says, and that's the pasuk, Aim Habanim Smecha Halaluka. So you see that she was called an aim, a mother, a matriarch, not just to the Jews that were born Jewish, but even to those who later on became Jewish. And I remember there was some members of our shul, and specifically one individual that I could say, and other people also, that they would eat in Mrs. Kirsch's house and everything. And we could say that, I mentioned before, it was Eim Habanim Smecha. She was a mother. She was certainly a mother to her children and to her grandchildren, but she was a mother figure to many, many people. It was Eim Habanim Smecha. And she should serve as an example for future generations as well. Okay, that's all right. Yeah, that's it. All right, listen, everything should go well. Listen, everybody should have good health from here on. Okay.
Good Yantiv, good Yor, Yashkoach, Rab Moshe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Very nice.